Biological invasions are such a huge ecological issue, right? But often the way we talk about them, it kind of gets stuck in the weeds, endless arguments about managing this species or that one. But the real complexity underneath is just how variable the outcomes are. I mean, a species can be totally disastrous in one place and, well, almost a non-issue somewhere else. The real question isn't just if a species shows up. It's about the level of chaos it causes and why that chaos looks so different everywhere. So today we're going to try and shortcut some of that complexity. We're doing a deep dive into a really significant study. It's called Invasion Impacts in Terrestrial Ecosystems, Global Patterns and Predictors. The lead author is Madhav P. Thakur, and it came out in Science back in October 2025. This isn't just another survey. It's a massive global synthesis trying to figure out the rules behind the environmental damage.
That's exactly right. And the mission here, I think, for us, and definitely for the authors, was to really get at that variability, that context dependency of the impact. See, historically, we had tons of local studies, like little snapshots, but no big picture connecting all the dots globally. So the authors wanted to build a predictive framework. It's not just asking if a species invades successfully, it's asking what specific things about the context, the place, the time predict how much damage it actually does to the ecosystem. And why does that damage vary so much?
Okay, yeah, let's unpack that a bit, because before this, like you said, so much research was focused on invasibility. What conditions let a species get a foothold and spread. But the authors make this great point. Just because a place can be invaded doesn't mean the invader will actually wreck the place. Establishment isn't the same as impact. So what was the biggest gap Thakur and his team were trying to fill by shifting focus from just getting into the actual damage caused?
Well, the big gap was the lack of a really systematic quantitative synthesis. We just didn't have one at this scale. We had, thousands of data points scattered across different studies, but no unified way to link specific ecological contexts, things like latitude or climate, or how many native plants were there, to the variation in impacts across the whole ecosystem. And they looked really broadly, too, not just one or two things. They analyzed impacts across 15 different properties, biotic stuff, abiotic stuff, trying to find some kind of consistent pattern in all that noise. And this broad scope let them test some really big ecological hypotheses head on, the ones we always talk about. They wanted to see if these established ideas actually hold up when you look globally. Like first, the biotic resistance hypothesis. Does having lots of native species really act like a firewall, limiting how bad the invader's impact gets?
Right, does diversity protect?
Exactly. Then there's the temporal shift idea. Do impacts maybe fade over time? Does the ecosystem kind of bounce back or learn to cope?
Resilience, yeah.
And finally, the traits hypothesis. Does having certain traits, like growing really fast if you're a plant or being large if you're an animal, automatically mean you're going to cause bigger problems? They were searching for those universal rules of damage.
And the way they did this, the methodology, it really underscores the scale. This wasn't just, a few field sites. It was a global meta-analysis. They pulled together data from 775 peer-reviewed studies that gave them 2,223 effect sizes. And just for you, the listener, an effect size is basically a standardized number that tells us how strong and in what direction a finding is. It lets scientists combine results from totally different experiments.
It's a powerful tool. But that huge data set also highlighted some real gaps in our current research landscape. Of those more than 2,200 effect sizes, the vast majority, 1,725, came from studies on plant invasions. Animal invasions, only 356 effect sizes. And microbial invasions like fungi or bacteria, a tiny 142.
Yeah, that's a big skew.
It is. It means we actually have a pretty solid, detailed picture of what invasive plants do globally. But for animals and microbes, even the really disruptive ones, the picture is much, much fuzzier, less comprehensive.
And it wasn't just about counting species either, right? The properties they looked at were really diverse. Biotic things like native plant diversity, sure, but also root biomass.
Right. And then the abiotic side, the physical environment, things like soil organic carbon, SOC, nutrient levels, even greenhouse gas emissions coming out of the soil.
So really covering the whole terrestrial ecosystem, its complexity.
Absolutely.
Okay, so after crunching all that data, looking across all those variables, all those studies, what popped out? What was the most reliable, widespread negative effect they found? The one thing invaders seem to damage consistently.
The finding that really held up most consistently across the globe was the reduction in native plant diversity. Now, this was mainly driven by invasive plants, but not exclusively. It just highlights that native diversity seems persistently vulnerable to invasion pressure. Doesn't really matter what the latitude is or the ecosystem type.
That seems really crucial. Because you often hear about overall species richness increasing after an invasion, just because you added the invader to the list.
Exactly. But this analysis isolates the impact on the native community. And that impact, it's almost always negative. Fewer native species stick around.
Okay, now here's where it gets really interesting, I think, connecting these ecological findings to bigger global issues like climate change.
Yeah.
The greenhouse gases, GHG. What did the analysis show about how invaders mess with soil, carbon, and nitrogen cycles?
Yeah, this was a significant part. They found that both invasive plants and invasive animals consistently increased soil emissions of CO2, carbon dioxide, and N2O, nitrous oxide.
Both major greenhouse gases.
Key greenhouse gases, yes. It seems like invaders somehow shift the soil's metabolism, making it release more of these gases. Methane, CH4, that was a bit different. It increased significantly, mainly under plant invasions, often because invasive plants can change the water levels or oxygen in the soil.
There was a catch here, right? A caveat the authors were careful to point out. Something about publication bias.
Yes, a crucial caveat. And it's a bit technical, but important for you, the listener, to grasp. They detected strong evidence of publication bias specifically for the greenhouse gas emission results.
Okay, publication bias. That sounds like jargon. Why does that matter for how we interpret these GHG findings?
It matters a lot because it means we have to be cautious. Publication bias happens when studies showing a strong effect, positive or negative, on something high profile, like CO2 emissions, are just more likely to get published than studies that find, well, nothing much happening.
Ah, so the dramatic results get seen more often.
Precisely. Which means the actual average impact on GHGs across all invasions might be smaller or maybe more variable than the published literature currently suggests. By contrast, those findings on native diversity loss, they showed much less evidence of this bias, which gives us more confidence in their reliability.
That context is absolutely vital.
Okay.
Okay, let's switch gears slightly, but stick with the soil. Soil organic carbon, SOC. This finding was fascinating because it showed opposite effects depending on who the invader was.
Completely opposite, yeah. Reflecting totally different ways they interact with the ecosystem. Invasive plants, generally speaking, increased SOC. You can think of this as the invader adding more carbon to the system, maybe through deeper roots, maybe just more leaves and stems falling as litter, or maybe changing how quickly things decompose in a way that stores more carbon. They're kind of like carbon inputters.
Okay, adding carbon makes sense.
But invasive animals, dramatically they reduced SOC. And this seemed largely driven by certain types of invaders we call ecosystem engineers, especially invasive earthworms.
Earthworms.
Yeah, things like earthworms. They munch through leaf litter incredibly fast, mix that organic matter deeper into the soil where it might decompose more quickly. So while the plants are adding new carbon, these animals are speeding up the breakdown and redistribution of the carbon that's already there.
It makes sense they'd act differently, but are we really saying tiny earthworms, just by eating leaves, are causing a measurable global reduction in soil carbon compared to, say, a massive, fast-growing invasive plant that's adding biomass? That feels a bit counterintuitive.
That's broadly what the meta-analysis suggests, yes. The animal mechanism is more about accelerating the processing, reducing the stable organic layer on top. The plant mechanism is about new inputs. And this contrast means, practically, that if you're managing an ecosystem, you have to think very differently about an invasive plant versus an invasive animal, even if they're in the same forest. Different strategies are needed.
That's fascinating. Okay, so we've talked about diversity, GHGs, soil carbon. But out of all the factors they tested, native diversity, latitude, climate, invader traits, invader type 1 variable seemed to rise above the rest as the most powerful predictor of how variable the impacts were. And that was
Invader residence time. Basically, how long the species has been established in that specific location.
time, just time.
Time. It outperformed all those other ecological factors. And the patterns they found over time were maybe the biggest surprise of the study because they were so different for the living parts versus the physical parts of the ecosystem.
How so? What were the different patterns?
Well, when they looked at the biotic loss specifically, the negative impact of invasive plants on native plant diversity, that effect, did not fade over time. In fact, it got worse. It intensified as residence time increased. The longer the invader was there, years, decades, the greater the cumulative loss of native species.
Wow. So the damage to the living community, it's not something that heals itself or stabilizes. It just keeps accumulating.
That's what the data strongly suggests. It points to this growing cumulative burden. But, and this is the key contrast that wasn't the pattern for the physical abiotic components, the negative effects on soil properties things like SOC or total nitrogen levels, they actually tended to weaken over time. Sometimes they disappeared completely after about, say, 6 to 10 years.
That is a really fundamental difference. It's like comparing a chronic infection to a broken bone. The physical environment, the bone might have ways to stabilize and mend itself over a decade or so.
Right.
But the biological community, the infection, just sees compounding damage the longer the pathogen, or the invader in this case, sticks around.
That's a pretty good analogy. It suggests some kind of ecosystem resilience or stabilization, at least for the soil chemistry.
Yeah.
Maybe invasive legumes initially spike nitrogen levels, but over time, native microbes or other processes adjust and bring those levels back towards normal. So yeah, biotic impacts worsen. Abiotic impacts can fade.
And this finding, that residence time is so dominant, it really shifts how we should think about prioritizing management, doesn't it? But let's quickly circle back to those classic hypotheses that turned out to be surprisingly weak predictors in this analysis. The biotic resistance hypothesis, that high native diversity should limit the invader's impact. That didn't hold up strongly for ecosystem-level effects.
It showed weak overall effects on the ecosystem-level impacts, yes. And this is a really important nuance. It clarifies a lot of debate. While having lots of native species might make it harder for a non-native plant to establish in the first place, that initial step.
Right, the getting in part.
Yes. But once the invader was established, native richness didn't consistently regulate the magnitude of the ecological impact over the long term. High native richness did seem to dampen some specific things, like how much the invader boosted overall productivity, but it didn't stop the loss of native species. It only partially buffered the symptoms, not the core ecological shift.
Okay, so resistance applies more to arrival than to long-term damage. And a similar weakness was found for traits, right? Things we often assume are key, like a plant's growth rate, measured by specific leaf area, SLA.
Yeah, SLA was overall a weak predictor of ecosystem impacts too. SLA, just to remind folks, it basically tells you how much leaf area a plant gets for a given investment in leaf mass. Thin, cheap leaves for fast growth versus thick, expensive leaves for durability.
And the assumption was fast-growing, cheap leaf invaders would hit hardest?
That was the hypothesis. But the study found that the traits helping a species establish or spread don't necessarily predict how much it's going to change the whole ecosystem once it's settled in. That link between being a fast resource user and causing massive ecosystem disruption is just not as strong or universal as we maybe thought.
Okay, so connecting all this to the bigger picture.
Yeah.
What does this mean for how we actually do conservation or manage these invasions on the ground?
Well, I think it gives us a much more evidence-based predictive framework. For those impacts that get worse over time, like the loss of native plant diversity, the message is clear. Management needs to prioritize rapid containment and aggressive, immediate impact mitigation. You can't wait.
Right, because waiting just makes the problem harder to solve.
Exactly. But conversely, for some of those abiotic responses, like maybe certain soil nutrient levels, where the effects might fade or stabilize after 6 to 10 years, maybe adaptive monitoring is the smarter approach there. You don't necessarily throw emergency funds at something if the data suggests the system is likely to sort itself out, chemically at least, within a decade. It helps target limited resources.
Makes sense. But with any huge study like this, we also need to talk limitations. You mentioned the data imbalance earlier, heavily skewed towards plants.
Definitely a limitation.
And the authors also point out a real lack of long-term studies, right? Especially outside of North America and Europe in the global south. That makes understanding these time dynamics tricky everywhere.
Absolutely. That lack of long-term data, particularly in diverse tropical and southern hemisphere ecosystems, really limits how confidently we can generalize about those temporal shifts. And estimating residence time itself is often imprecise, relying on patchy historical records.
So where does the research need to go next?
Future research really needs to tackle those geographic gaps aggressively. We need more studies in underrepresented regions and ideally more experimental studies where scientists actually manipulate conditions, not just observational ones. Plus, way more focus on getting good trait-based data for invasive animals and microbes. That's where the data is thinnest right now. We need to catch up on the non-plant invaders.
So wrapping this up, what's the big takeaway here, if you had to distill it down? For me, it's that we have to stop thinking about the variability in invasion impacts as just random noise. It's not noise. It's systematic. It follows patterns. And a huge driver of those patterns is simply how long the invader has been around. It moves the science from just describing impacts towards actually being able to predict them, at least to some extent.
I agree. Which leads to, I think, a really important final thought for you, the listener, to consider. If that loss of native plant diversity is indeed a cumulative effect, something that gets progressively worse over decades, what does that mean for policy? What kind of fundamental shift do we need to address species that haven't just arrived, but have been established for 50, maybe 100 years or more? Does management essentially become long-term restoration at that point? And is eradication even conceivable for those really entrenched long-term invaders?
That's a heavy question to ponder, a real challenge looking forward. Well, thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the global patterns of biological invasions and what drives their impact.